Rome, June 22, 1983. The city hummed with its usual summer vibrance. Tourists flooded the piazzas, gelato melted faster than it could be eaten, and life moved with the rhythm of scooters zipping through cobblestone alleys. But in a quiet Vatican apartment, nestled behind the ancient walls of the world's smallest country, the Orlandi family was about to step into a nightmare that would never end. Emanuela, a bright, curious 15-year-old girl with long dark hair and a love for music, said goodbye to her mother that afternoon. "I'll be back after my flute lesson," she smiled, swinging her bag over her shoulder. It was a simple routine. She had made this short trip to her music school near Piazza di Sant'Apollinare countless times, but that day she never returned. By nightfall, panic set in. Her family, her father, Ercole Orlandi, a trusted employee of the Vatican, and her mother, Maria, began calling friends, police, and Vatican authorities. But all they got were shrugs and polite indifference. "Maybe she ran away," someone suggested. "Teenage girls do that." But the Orlandis knew better. Emanuela wasn't rebellious. She had plans. She was excited about an upcoming school trip. She had left home with just a small amount of money, barely enough for a snack, not an escape. Something was wrong. And it was just the beginning. In the days that followed, Rome transformed into a city on edge. Posters of Emanuela's face, smiling and innocent, were plastered on walls, bus stops, and lampposts. Her siblings distributed flyers, pleading with anyone who might have seen her. The media caught wind of the story, and soon all of Italy was watching. Then came the calls. Mysterious voices claimed to have Emanuela. They spoke of political demands, of prisoner exchanges, of the man who tried to assassinate Pope John Paul II, Mehmet Ali Akka. Could Emanuela's disappearance be linked to global terrorism, to Cold War politics? The idea seemed outlandish, but the calls were specific, and they kept coming. Meanwhile, inside the Vatican, something felt off. The Church issued statements, yes, but their actions were slow, guarded, secretive. The Orlandis felt isolated, as if doors were quietly closing around them. And rumors began to spread. Whispers of the mafia, of debts, of secrets buried deep within the Vatican's ancient corridors. Theories multiplied, each more chilling than the last. And Emanuela? She had vanished, without a trace. No witnesses, no leads. Just silence, and a gnawing sense that the truth was being hidden. Not just by criminals, but perhaps by powerful men in robes. As the days turned into weeks, the Orlandi family entered a surreal new existence. Life outside their home carried on. Tourists still took photos of the Sistine Chapel. Priests still walked the gardens of the Apostolic Palace. But inside their modest Vatican apartment, time had frozen. The unanswered question of "where is Emanuela?" began to metastasize, infecting not only their home, but the collective consciousness of a nation. And then the story twisted again. A man calling himself the American phoned multiple times. His voice was calm, deliberate, and always untraceable. He insisted Emanuela was alive, being held by a group demanding the release of Akka, the man who'd tried to kill the Pope in 1981. The demands were oddly formal, politically precise, and terrifyingly real. The Italian government, initially dismissive, began to pay attention. So did international media. Newspapers speculated wildly. Was Emanuela a pawn in a geopolitical game between East and West? Between Catholicism and communism? The Cold War was at its height, and Akka had ties to Bulgarian intelligence. If true, this wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a message, one that reached all the way to the Vatican's highest echelons. But something didn't sit right. There were inconsistencies. The caller offered no proof of life, and Vatican officials remained suspiciously quiet. What were they protecting? Or whom? Then came a chilling detail. Days before her disappearance, Emanuela had told her sister that a man had approached her near the music school, offering a job to promote Avon Cosmetics at events. "It pays well," he said. "You're pretty. You'd be perfect." She declined, but he was persistent. And now she was gone. It sounded like grooming, a trap. And if that was true, the political calls might be a smokescreen, a distraction from something far darker. As Rome's investigators followed conflicting leads, the Vatican began to retreat into its shell. The Pope, John Paul II, did something unprecedented. He publicly appealed to Emanuela's captors, pleading for her release during his Angelus prayer. It was a global moment. But behind the solemn prayer, Vatican corridors remained tight-lipped. No internal investigation, no transparency, just silence. It felt like the Holy City was circling its wagons, and that silence screamed. Theories began to fester. Some whispered of a Vatican sex ring, protected by powerful clergy. Others believed the mafia was involved, specifically the Banda della Maliana, a brutal Roman crime syndicate with deep ties to Vatican banking. According to one theory, Emanuela was taken as leverage over unpaid debts. The name that surfaced again and again: Enrico de Pedis, a gang leader buried, strangely, inside a Vatican church, an honor usually reserved for saints and bishops. Why would a gangster be interred there? The Orlandi family didn't know what to believe anymore. Their calls for answers were met with cold bureaucracy. Each press conference brought hope, then despair. Each new tip, a false dawn. But one thing had become clear. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was a labyrinth, and at its center, something ancient and deeply protected. Years passed, but for the Orlandi family, time didn't heal. It calcified. Each anniversary of Emanuela's disappearance brought fresh headlines, new conspiracy theories, and a deeper ache of uncertainty. Her face remained on lampposts, her name whispered like a prayer. But behind the media frenzy, the truth was still locked away. Then, in 2005, something strange happened. Just days after Pope John Paul II's death, a cryptic message surfaced. A former member of the Banda della Maliana claimed that Emanuela had indeed been kidnapped, not for politics, but to send a message to the Vatican. A message written in the language of terror. The informant named names. He spoke of a deal gone wrong, of money laundered through the Vatican bank, and of silence purchased with innocence. But his statements were dismissed as hearsay. No evidence, no body, no case. Still, the whispers grew louder. Why was de Pedis buried inside the church of Santa Apollinare, the very same place Emanuela had her last music lesson? It was no longer just a coincidence. It felt like a message. And when journalists pressed church officials, they got evasive answers or none at all. The Vatican's shield of secrecy held firm, but in 2012, that wall cracked. At the request of prosecutors and under mounting public pressure, de Pedis's tomb was opened. Cameras rolled as the marble floor was lifted. Inside, his coffin gleamed. Lavish, metallic, far more elaborate than a gangster should warrant. But Emanuela wasn't there. No bones, no clues, just a chilling void. Yet the act itself was symbolic. For the first time, the Vatican had allowed investigators to peer beneath its sacred floorboards. It sparked new hope, and with it, new leads. Then came another twist, and another tomb. In 2019, the Orlandi family received an anonymous letter. It claimed Emanuela was buried in the Teutonic Cemetery, a tiny graveyard inside Vatican City reserved for German nobles. The letter even pointed to a specific angel statue and read, "Look where the angel is pointing." In an astonishing move, Vatican officials granted access. The world watched as ancient tombs were opened live on television. The tension was unbearable. But again, they were empty. Not just of Emanuela, but of the two princesses who were supposed to be buried there. The remains had been moved decades earlier. No records, no explanation. Another mystery layered atop the last. For the Orlandis, it felt like a game of shadows. Each revelation was half a truth. Each clue, a dead end. Was Emanuela beneath the Vatican? Had she ever left its walls? Or was the real secret something even darker? Something no tomb could contain? One thing was becoming painfully clear. Someone, somewhere, had orchestrated her disappearance with meticulous care. And that someone had protection. The kind that only the most powerful institutions on Earth could offer. As more decades slipped by, the case of Emanuela Orlandi evolved into something almost mythic. She had become a symbol, not just of a missing girl, but of a deeper rot beneath sacred stone. Journalists, independent investigators, even amateur sleuths had all taken turns trying to piece together the jigsaw. And through all of it, the Vatican remained tight-lipped, offering solemn nods and ambiguous statements, but little else. It was as if Emanuela had been absorbed into the very architecture of the Vatican. A ghost hidden between its columns, a secret no one dared speak aloud. But not everyone was afraid. Pietro Orlandi, Emanuela's older brother, transformed into a relentless voice for truth. He never stopped. For 40 years, he gave interviews, organized protests, and challenged the highest authorities of the Catholic Church. He stood outside St. Peter's Basilica, with a photo of Emanuela and a microphone, telling the world, "My sister is not a rumor. She was real, and someone here knows what happened." His persistence struck a nerve. Supporters rallied, hashtags trended. The world began to see the Vatican not as a bastion of moral clarity, but as a fortress of unanswered questions. Then came the Netflix documentary in 2022, The Vatican Girl. The series went viral, dragging the Orlandi case back into global headlines. Viewers were shocked, not just by the mystery but by the Vatican's chronic silence. And buried within the documentary was one moment that ignited a firestorm. A woman, once a Vatican insider, claimed Emanuela had been taken for a sex party involving high-ranking clergy. The implication was explosive. Suddenly, the theory no one dared voice in public was now out in the open. If true, it would mean not only a crime, but a cover-up of biblical proportions. Public pressure reignited. Protesters gathered at the Vatican gates with signs reading, "Where is Emanuela?" and "You have the keys. Open the doors." Even the Italian parliament began asking questions. Why, after all these years, had the Vatican never fully cooperated? Why did they treat this not as a crime, but as an inconvenience? And then, in early 2023, a miracle of sorts. The Vatican announced it was reopening the case. Not under outside pressure, they insisted, but from within. Few believed that claim. Still, it was movement. For the first time in 4 decades, the institution at the heart of the storm admitted that Emanuela's case deserved another look. But was it sincere, or just an act of damage control? No one could say. The files were still sealed, the investigators still cloaked in secrecy. Pietro remained skeptical and vocal. "They know what happened," he told reporters. "They've always known." And behind his eyes was the gaze of a man who had stared into the abyss for 40 years and refused to blink. The world watched as old Vatican doors creaked open, one by one. But would the truth, whatever it was, finally step out into the light? The reopening of the case in 2023 reignited public obsession, but also unearthed a darker emotion that had lingered just beneath the surface for years: rage. Rage at a system that had stayed silent. Rage at the Vatican for decades of denial. And rage at the idea that perhaps Emanuela had never been truly lost, only hidden. Italian prosecutors launched parallel inquiries. Meetings between Vatican officials and state investigators were described as cordial but tense. Files once deemed untouchable were requested. Names long buried in internal records resurfaced. The game had changed. But it came with a warning. The closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it might become. Inside the Vatican walls, silence morphed into caution. Whispers of internal factions, those who wanted transparency versus those who feared collapse, became louder. The institution stood at a crossroads: open the vault and risk the Church's global credibility, or maintain the wall of secrecy and let the storm grow. And Pietro, he didn't flinch. He marched again, this time accompanied by thousands. Mothers, students, priests, even disillusioned believers walked beside him. It was no longer just about Emanuela. It was about accountability, justice, and the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. Then another revelation sent shockwaves through Italy. A former Vatican gendarme, speaking anonymously, claimed to have seen classified files referencing Emanuela. He described a Vatican dossier, an internal document detailing payments made for the maintenance of a young girl over several years. The implication was horrifying. Emanuela may not have been killed immediately. She may have been held, moved, hidden, and if so, then who knew? Who signed those payments? Who allowed it to continue? The Vatican denied the document's authenticity, calling it a fabrication. But the story wouldn't die. Too many puzzle pieces once scattered were now beginning to align. The Avon man, the Banda della Maliana, De Pedis's luxurious tomb, the angel in the cemetery, the sex party allegation, and now secret payments? The narrative was no longer fragmented. It was beginning to form a horrifying picture, not a random crime, not a political pawn, but a deliberate act, a sacrifice, protected by an impenetrable system. International pressure mounted. The European Parliament demanded transparency. Human rights organizations began asking if the Vatican should still enjoy full diplomatic immunity in criminal investigations. And in Rome, the mood turned. The Vatican was no longer seen as the city's spiritual heart. It was the eye of a decades-long storm. With every step forward, the case transformed from a tragic mystery into a damning indictment of unchecked power. And yet, Emanuela remained a ghost. No grave, no bones, just shadows cast by golden domes. The question now was simple and terrifying. What happens if the truth is too dangerous to reveal? As the investigation deepened, something unusual began to happen. Vatican spokespeople, once silent, aloof, and mechanical, began speaking with a tone that bordered on desperation. For the first time, they publicly admitted the case was an open wound within the Church. Cardinal after cardinal stepped forward to offer condolences, prayers, even vague promises of transparency. But to Pietro Orlandi, and to millions watching, these gestures felt too rehearsed, too late, and too strategic. As if they weren't searching for Emanuela, but for absolution. Then came a letter. Not to the Orlandi family, but to Italian authorities, sent anonymously and postmarked from within Rome. It contained only a few typed lines and a single photograph. The text read, "She was here, for years, until she wasn't." The photo? A narrow hallway, dimly lit, with marble walls and a rusted door at the end. Investigators immediately recognized it. It was beneath Vatican property, part of the old catacombs, some of which had been sealed off for decades. Officials rushed to access the space. But when they arrived, the corridor was empty, recently cleaned, freshly locked. Once again, the case had danced just out of reach, as if the truth itself were alive, watching, anticipating, and always one step ahead. Journalists began to refer to Emanuela's disappearance not as a crime, but as a system, a structure of concealment. Not one man, not one motive, but layers upon layers of protection, all orbiting around a single horrifying possibility: that the Vatican, for all its grandeur and sanctity, had chosen to protect itself over an innocent girl. As these ideas spread, so did the backlash. Faithful Catholics were torn. Some felt betrayed. Others refused to believe the Church could be complicit in such darkness. A divide opened between belief and institution, between spirituality and power. Priests who had once remained silent now hinted at deeper secrets. "There are corridors we don't walk," one said. "Rooms where silence is the only thing that survives." It sounded like fiction, but too many elements, too many bodies buried without explanation, too many files conveniently lost, made it impossible to dismiss. Then, Pietro dropped a bombshell of his own. In a live interview on national television, he claimed to have met with a retired Vatican official who privately confessed that Emanuela had been seen alive years after her disappearance, and not just anywhere, but inside Vatican City. The man wouldn't testify. Too afraid. Too old. But he had told Pietro something else. If they dig where they're not supposed to, they won't just find Emanuela, they'll find everything. The quote went viral. Speculation exploded. What did everything mean? Was Emanuela's case connected to other disappearances? Other scandals? Were there more victims, more secrets buried under the polished floors of the Holy See? For the first time, it felt like the truth wasn't just a possibility. It was a ticking clock. And somewhere, behind stone walls and velvet curtains, people were watching the clock run down. The weight of 40 years had transformed the Orlandi case into something beyond a mystery. It had become a war of narratives. On one side, a grieving family armed with truth, memory, and unrelenting determination. On the other, a sacred institution shielded by centuries of influence, tradition, and silence. The battlefield was Rome, but the echoes of this conflict reverberated far beyond its walls. Every new theory, every old document resurfacing, every anonymous tip sent shivers down spines. Not just in Italy, but around the globe. Because Emanuela's story was no longer just about her. It was about the dangerous cost of asking forbidden questions. Then, a moment that shattered the quiet. In a public hearing before an Italian parliamentary committee in late 2023, it was revealed that multiple Vatican insiders had been subpoenaed. Several invoked diplomatic immunity, but one did not. A former archivist, pale and trembling, testified under oath that key files relating to Emanuela had been reorganized and transferred to private custody in the 1990s, on direct order from an unnamed cardinal. The room froze. Journalists gasped. Lawmakers demanded names. But the archivist claimed he couldn't remember. "Too much time has passed," he said. "But I remember the fear that I will never forget." That testimony ignited something. Protests flared up again. Vigils turned into rallies. A new generation, many of whom weren't even born when Emanuela disappeared, flooded social media with her photo. Hashtags surged across timelines. Justice for Emanuela, Vatican secrets, where is she? The pressure became unbearable. For the first time, there were whispers that the Pope himself, Pope Francis, might address the case directly. Not in vague terms, not in scripted prayers, but openly, transparently. Then came one of the most surreal moments in the history of the Catholic Church. On a Sunday morning, standing before tens of thousands in St. Peter's Square, Pope Francis broke protocol. Midway through his address, he paused, lowered his script, and looked out over the crowd. "To the family of Emanuela Orlandi," he said, "and to all those still waiting for answers, I promise you, nothing will remain hidden forever." The words were brief, measured, but they hit like a thunderclap. Inside the Vatican, the old guard was reportedly furious. Some cardinals felt betrayed. Others feared collapse. To admit fault would be to admit corruption had reached the heart of the Church. But to remain silent now could mean something worse: global reckoning. The pressure had created a fracture, and through that fracture, truth was beginning to leak. But Pietro wasn't celebrating. "I've heard promises before," he said. "What I need is proof. What I want is my sister." His voice cracked as he held up the same photograph. Emanuela at 15, smiling, unaware of what waited for her. "If the Vatican truly wants peace," he added, "they know where to dig." As 2024 unfolded, it felt as though the walls of the Vatican were breathing heavier. Behind its guarded gates and gold-leafed chapels, something was stirring. Investigators, now operating under joint oversight from Italian and Vatican authorities, began tracing old financial records, interviewing retired clergy, and re-examining timelines once considered irrelevant. It was forensic archaeology, digging not through dirt, but through decades of denial. And then, without warning, the Vatican made a move no one saw coming. A short statement, just a few lines, quietly published on an official website. It confirmed that certain documents related to the Orlandi case had been withheld due to clerical errors, and were now available for review by proper authorities. The language was clinical, sterile, but behind it was the earthquake everyone had waited for. A veiled admission: information had been hidden. Whether by mistake or by design, no one could yet say. But it was enough. The investigation roared back to life. Journalists, lawyers, and investigators rushed in. Among the unearthed files was one curious document: a travel log, dated 1985, listing a Vatican vehicle crossing into Switzerland with special internal cargo. No further description, no driver's name, no destination address. But the timing aligned perfectly with an unverified tip from decades earlier, that Emanuela had been moved across borders. The log raised impossible questions. Was she alive in 1985? If so, what happened after? And who approved that trip? The Orlandi family issued a new plea. This time, it was to the people, not the Vatican. "If you know something," Pietro said, "even if it's been 40 years, even if you were part of it, tell us now, before it's too late." And for the first time, they weren't met with silence. Anonymous letters began arriving again. Fragments, clues, names of buildings, shifts in schedules. One note read, "You've been looking under the floor. Try looking above." Investigators interpreted it as a hint toward the Vatican's attic archives, a section few ever access. Permission was requested, denied, then quietly granted. And inside those forgotten halls, among the dust and relics, something was found. What it was exactly has not been publicly confirmed. But rumors suggest it wasn't a body. It was worse. It was documentation, records of surveillance, internal memos, and perhaps a list of individuals tied to Emanuela's disappearance. Vatican officials have not commented. The files are sealed under investigation, but according to an unnamed source within the Italian justice system. It's no longer about whether something happened, it's about how high it goes. Today, Emanuela Orlandi remains missing. No remains, no confirmed sightings, just a legacy carved into the conscience of a nation, and into the soul of a church reckoning with its own shadow. Her face is still printed on flyers, her name still chanted by protesters, and her story still told in whispers behind Vatican doors. But perhaps the most terrifying part of it all is this: she didn't vanish in a war zone. She didn't disappear in the wilderness. She vanished inside the heart of the most powerful religious institution on earth. And if that place can lose a child and keep that secret for over 4 decades, then what else has it buried?